Almost from the beginning of the war against Japan, Allied military leaders were divided in their opinions on the best way to defeat the enemy. The British favoured a holding action until the Germans were conquered. The Americans insisted that some offensive action must begin early to prevent the Japanese from continued expansion. At the end of March 1942, the American Joint Chiefs of Staff divided the Pacific War Zone into two commands: General Douglas MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Area and Admiral Chester Nimitz's Pacific Ocean Area. The Japanese drive against Port Moresby and the invasion of the American Aleutian Islands in the spring of 1942 convinced the British that offensive action was necessary, but it did not resolve the debate over how it should be carried out. The Battle of Midway was a defensive effort. The war in the Aleutians bogged down. The American invasion of the Solomons was a holding action, designed to deny the enemy an air base on Guadalcanal that could be used to stage bombing raids on Australia and cut Allied communications. When discussing the road back, the traditional wisdom held for a drive through the Central Pacific. That strategy had been accepted in all American war plans since the 1920s. General MacArthur disagreed. From the moment he landed in Australia and set up headquarters at Brisbane, he argued for a drive up through Indonesia to the Philippines. In the summer of 1942, MacArthur's army forces and Nimitz's naval forces were both ordered to remove the enemy threat in New Guinea and the Solomons, but their progress was slow and not a very convincing argument for MacArthur's island-hopping strategy. At Casablanca in Morocco in January 1943, the British and American leaders met to plan their joint war efforts for the coming months. Admiral King argued for the Central Pacific offensive against Japan. General MacArthur was relegated to a supporting role. Diversionary was the term. The major American offensive would be conducted from Pearl Harbor into the Central Pacific, with the first target being the Marshall Islands. These islands had been part of the old German Empire before World War I. The Japanese had taken them and been given a mandate over them by the League of Nations. What had happened to them since was very fuzzy in the minds of the rest of the world. The Japanese had withdrawn from the League of Nations in the mid-1930s, when their war policies were criticized. It was suspected that Japan had fortified the Marshalls, but so little was known about the area that even the naval charts had many bare spots. What was known was that the nearest of the Marshall Islands to any Allied territory was still out of range of land-based aircraft. This was the edge of the Japanese Empire. From the Marshalls, the Japanese could island hop all the way to Tokyo. If the Allies could capture the Marshalls, they would take a giant step into the Pacific. The Marshalls would provide them with a base for further assaults on the inner empire, beginning with the Marianas. The Joint Chiefs of Staff asked Admiral Nimitz for a plan to invade the Marshalls. Even as the request came in June 1943, Nimitz was considering invading the Gilbert Islands first. His photo reconnaissance planes had discovered an airstrip on Bisio Islet at Tarawa Atoll and a seaplane base on Butaritari Islet of Makin Atoll. His Chief of Staff, Admiral Raymond Spruance, suggested that the Marshalls would be a tough nut to crack and that the American amphibious forces were not yet ready. Spruance wanted to invade the Gilberts. The Gilberts were better known, said Spruance, correctly, as they had been a British possession until seized by the Japanese in 1941. Reconnaissance could be carried out by land-based aircraft from the Ellis Islands, which were held by the Allies. There was another reason for Spruance's caution. The only battle-tested amphibious troops were the Marines of the 1st and 2nd Marine Divisions. Additionally, the Pacific forces had only one experience in landing and supplying invading forces, at Guadalcanal. The conditions there were considerably different from what would be faced in a Central Pacific invasion. At Guadalcanal, the Americans had been backed by service bases in the New Hebrides and New Caledonia island chains, not far from the scene of action. When the Marshalls' invasion was undertaken, and it would be Spruance who would lead it, there would be no land-based air support from these islands and Australia. Admiral Turner would come up from the South Pacific to direct the new invasion, but by the summer of 1943 he had not yet arrived, nor did the Central Pacific forces have a troop commander. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were asking for an invasion within a few months. Admiral Spruance was certain that the Marshal's invasion was too ambitious, and that it would be better to pick a softer target than the Marshals for the first effort. Spruance convinced Nimitz, who in turn convinced the Joint Chiefs of Staff, partly with his argument about the air bases in the Gilberts that could harry the invaders of the Marshals if not neutralized first. So the Gilberts came first as a learning operation. The lesson was costly and bitter. It became evident that Spruance had been correct. They needed a learning operation. It was unfortunate that they had chosen Tarawa, one of the most fiercely defended atolls in the Pacific, and that a serious error in the calculation of tides left hundreds of Marines in shallow water, braving interlocking fields of fire from defenders as they tried to wade ashore on Little Baisio Islet. As a result of this error and the stubbornness of the Japanese defenders, nearly 1,000 Marines lost their lives. Furthermore, the Americans had made the mistake of attacking a group that had been fortified by the Japanese after an earlier raid. In August 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson's 2nd Marine Raider Battalion had attacked Butaritari in the Makin Atoll. After the raid, the Japanese fortified the Gilberts, and when the Marines returned, they were ready for them. On the positive side, the Marines and the Navy learned quickly. General Smith fought hard to secure the use of amphibious landing craft, which Admiral Turner had initially deemed unnecessary. Turner learned that without amphibious craft, they might have lost the battle. He also learned that shore bombardment must be longer and more thorough than the Gilbert's barrage had been. Additionally, the escort carriers used to support the troops needed better night protection. The light carrier Independence had been torpedoed just before sunset on D-Day, and the escort carrier Liscombe was sunk by a torpedo 4 days later. The first torpedo was delivered by a bomber, and the second by a submarine, both at times when light and darkness were merging. Such attacks would become commonplace throughout the rest of the war. The battle at Tarawa led to an enormous outcry in America due to the casualties. The military leaders knew, but could not say, that the campaign had to be costly. There was no way for the Americans to learn how to storm Japanese defences without trying. By choosing the Gilberts, they had driven a wedge deep into the lines of communication of the Japanese at Truk and in the southern islands. 20 years later, historians might argue that the Gilberts operation could have been skipped and the first landing staged in the Marshalls. However, such speculations fail to consider the reaction of the Japanese had circumstances been different. In the winter of 1943 to 1944, Nimitz and his commanders were too busy for speculation. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were pressing the Navy to take the Marshalls and the Carolines to use as the base for the assault against the inner Japanese Empire. To accomplish this task, Nimitz would have to capture hundreds of islands in the 3 million square mile circle of Micronesia, an effort bound to be wasteful in men and equipment. Nimitz insisted that it was not necessary. Eniwetok, the principal atoll in the Marshalls, held one of the best ports in the Pacific, which was what was needed for the future build-up. Nimitz was receptive to the requests of Admiral Turner and the demands of General Holland Smith for change. Turner anticipated that the Japanese would build up Eniwetok's and Kwajalein's defences after the fall of the Gilberts. To counter this, he wanted constant observation and bombing by land-based aircraft and carriers. Mullinix Field, named for the admiral who had gone down with the Liscombe, was built on Buota. The Navy built up the Baisio airstrip as well. Soon, daily observation and bombing flights began against the Marshalls. General Smith wanted longer naval bombardment by 2 or 3 days, more airstrikes and better air support. To achieve this, he proposed that a Marine air wing be assigned to the escort carriers so that the troops ashore could be assured of air support from pilots who understood their problems. He also insisted that all amphibious divisions be equipped with amphibious vehicles capable of bringing troops, tanks and guns over the shallows and reefs he expected to find in future landings, 500 such craft for each division. This change would ensure that the first grave mistake of Tarawa would not be repeated. In the Gilberts invasion, Major General Holland Smith had been assigned the Army's 27th Division to attack Makin. From the beginning, he had been unhappy with the choice. He had no administrative control over that division, which meant he did not supervise its training for amphibious combat. Since Smith's job just before coming to the Pacific had been Chief Training Officer on the West Coast for the Marines, he knew as much about amphibious warfare as anyone else in the United States. The Army knew virtually nothing, but the 27th Division was trained by the Army under Lieutenant General Robert C. Richardson, commander of Army troops in Hawaii. Richardson wanted Holland Smith's job, complicating matters from the start. Holland Smith laid out the plans for the operation and handed those for the 27th Division to the Army. General Richardson then decorated his staff for the massive planning they had done. In the invasion, Holland Smith was frustrated with the slow movement and incompetence of the 27th Division. By the end of the second day, despite light opposition, they had still failed to capture the airfield and link their two invading groups. Holland Smith came ashore and spent the night at Ralph Smith's command post, feeling fortunate to be alive at dawn, as the area was peppered all night by rifle fire, not from the Japanese, but from wild-shooting Army sentries. Smith returned to the flagship shaken and disappointed with the Army's performance. He knew it was not the soldiers, but the training that was at fault. The second-hand notes available to the training officers in Hawaii were fragmentary, and did not cover the use of tanks and other aspects. The Army had not been given Navy vessels to support their training. As far as the Army was concerned, another significant mistake was entrusting the land-based operations to a Marine general. Lieutenant General Richardson, who was also the Army commander in the Central Pacific, resented the way Howling Mad Smith had stormed ashore at Macon and criticized Major General Ralph Smith, commander of the 27th Infantry Division, for his failure to move his troops. One reason for the failure was the Army's very late start in amphibious training. The major literature available to Ralph Smith was from the 1930s and early 1940s. The best information he had was a set of notes prepared by Army officers who had studied at Navy training centers. This failure was not due to oversight, but to the nature of the Gilbert's invasion. The 2nd Marine Division, which invaded Tarawa, had received most of its training under fire in the invasions of Guadalcanal and other islands of the South Pacific, and was shipped directly to Tarawa. General Holland Smith had expected the Army to provide equally competent troops, which of course had been impossible, but Smith's principal objection to the Army troops of the 27th Division had been the failures of their officers. This objection was not forgiven by General Ralph Smith and General Robert C. Richardson, the latter of whom quickly congratulated Marine Major General Julian Smith and the 2nd Marines on their efficient work at Tarawa. The lessons learned from our battle on Basio Island will be of greatest value to our future operations, General Richardson remarked. The first of these lessons, he decided, was to replace the Marine Command with an effective Army command, and he recommended this to Admiral Chester Nimitz as the invasion of the Marshalls was in the planning stage. This recommendation was supposed to be absolutely secret. General Richardson took the precaution of preparing a for-your-eyes-only memorandum to Admiral Nimitz, asking that in future General Holland Smith's duties be restricted to the straight administration of Marine troops only. The tactical command, control of the troops that would invade the islands, should be given to Richardson, and he should furnish all troops for the coming invasions. At Sinkspack headquarters, Nimitz's senior officers privately referred to General Richardson as Nervous Nelly, because he was constantly worrying about problems that never developed. But this memo represented something far deeper, the perennial quarrel between the Army and the Marines over troop employment. The Navy had always used Marines as its prime shock troops, and the Army had always resented this. General Richardson shared this distaste for the employment of Marines to do what he considered to be soldiers' work. His emotions were also aroused because Major General Ralph Smith was a protégé of his, dating back before the days when Richardson had commanded the Army 7th Corps, and Ralph Smith had been one of his lieutenants. Howling mad. Smith's salty words about the military conduct and failures of Ralph Smith had gotten around Pearl Harbor, and this was Richardson's response. No one would ever accuse Admiral Nimitz of violating a confidence, but within a matter of hours the contents of the Richardson memorandum were known within the Sinkspack staff. The naval officers were more or less amused at Richardson's gall, but the Marines were furious. Fortunately for Army-Navy relations, very little of the 27th Division would be employed in the Marshal's invasion. That decision was made months before the Smith versus Smith controversy began. While the men of the 27th Division were in action, men of the 7th Division's 17th and 32nd Regimental Combat Teams were preparing for the Marshal's invasion. These were the only troops of the 7th Division that had been in previous combat, the Aleutians. They led in the training of all the other troops of the 7th and the 27th 106th Infantry Regiment, which would be the Army forces involved in the Marshal's invasion. The Marine forces would be the 4th Marine Division and the 22nd Marine Regimental Combat Team. The invasion of the Gilbert Islands was completed by the end of November 1943, and the fighting troops were replaced by garrison forces. Within the week, an airstrike was made by the new fast carrier force that had been building in the Pacific over the past few months. Task Force 50, as it was called, was commanded by Rear Admiral Charles A. Pownall. It consisted of 4 new Essex-class fleet carriers, the Enterprise, which was sturdy if not so new, the Saratoga, for which the naval word was venerable, and 5 of the new light carriers. Task Force 50 was divided into 4 groups, each commanded by a Rear Admiral. It was the most powerful naval air force afloat anywhere in the world, and superior to the Japanese carrier group for the first time. 2 of the carrier groups, Admiral Arthur Radford's and Admiral Frederick Sherman's, were in need of repairs and supply. At the end of the Gilbert's battle, Sherman's Princeton, for example, was suffering from vibration in her propulsion system that had been exacerbated by 10,000 miles of continual steaming in the past few weeks. 3 helmsmen had been injured, and the engineering department was worried about more casualties. The Princeton was sent back to Pearl Harbor for repairs, first having transferred all her operational aircraft to other carriers, except those needed for patrol, and having taken aboard the war wherries damaged in the recent series of airstrikes against Japanese bases in the South and Central Pacific. To a lesser degree, the other carriers of these groups were in the same condition, so Admiral Pownall took with him his own group and that of Admiral Montgomery to strike the Marshalls. The force consisted of 6 carriers with 386 aircraft. The 2 groups made an ocean rendezvous east of the Marshalls and took on fuel. Then, on December 1st, they steered west and headed for Kwajalein Atoll in the middle of the Marshalls. About 40 miles east of the Marshall Chain, they launched planes early on the morning of December 4th, surprising the Japanese, who had expected the attack to come from the south and had concentrated their air power on the west side of the island chain. The Americans came down from the north. The advantage of surprise was brief. The Japanese soon had 50 fighters in the air, and a heavy barrage of anti-aircraft fire came up. But the Japanese had obviously not expected an airstrike quite so soon. Several warships and freighters were in the various harbours. The planes came over Roy Islet in Kwajalein Atoll and strafed and bombed. But the Japanese had been extremely clever in their camouflage. They had built mock aircraft of bamboo and reeds which they left on the runways and parking areas. They concealed all but their immediately operational aircraft in hidden revetments, often protected by heavy log walls and roofs. Consequently, although the Americans struck hard at Roy, they destroyed only 3 bombers and 16 fighters. They did not know they had left behind unhurt some 40 Japanese aircraft. The cruiser Isuzu was at anchor in the lagoon, and they attacked it, but the Isuzu managed to avoid all but 2 bombs, which knocked out her rudder. One big transport was torpedoed and blew up with a satisfying explosion that suggested she was carrying ammunition. Other planes headed for the Japanese naval base at the southern end of the atoll. At Kwajalein Atoll, they struck Kwajalein, Ebeye, and Enubuj Islands. At the end of the strike, the American pilots reported enthusiastically on their performance as they talked to the air intelligence officers aboard their carriers. Some pilots, however, and several of the carrier captains wanted to send a second strike. That was the plan, but Admiral Pownall grew nervous here in the enemy heartland. He decided that the uncertain performance of several carriers had been caused by exhaustion. After all, the ships and planes had been in action since the early days of November. Pownall decided to cancel the second strike on Kwajalein and headed for Pearl Harbor. Meanwhile, planes from the Yorktown alone launched a strike against Votya. It accomplished very little, and that failure seemed to bear out the sensibility of Admiral Pownall's decision. After all, he had no night fighters. Admiral Radford's carrier group was the only one so equipped, and he wanted to be as far out of bomber range from the Marshalls as possible by nightfall. Between 11 a.m. and 3 p.m., when the bombers were recovered and the task force steamed eastward, several Japanese planes attacked, but half a dozen of them were shot down by ship anti-aircraft guns. When the carrier captains began comparing notes, they concluded that they had sent off 246 planes against the atoll and had destroyed 55 Japanese aircraft, most of them in the air. They also claimed to have sunk 4 Japanese ships. But the 2 cruisers in the lagoon both escaped serious damage, and so did most of the merchant ships. The last plane landed and the losses counted, 5 American planes. The task force began to move. "Mission completed," signalled Admiral Pownall. But aboard the carriers, the photo specialists were developing film, and the films showed what the pilots had not seen: the existence of dozens of aircraft in those camouflaged revetments and unhurt ships. Aboard the Yorktown, Captain J.J. Clark wanted to go back for another strike, for his photos showed how little he had done at Votya. But Pownall said no, they were going home, and he was in command. They left, leaving behind many Japanese aircraft that would have to be accounted for later. As Pownall had gloomily expected, the Japanese came after them that night from all parts of the Marshalls. The snoopers showed up at dusk and remained with them. In the later hours of December 4th, after the moon was high, the attacks began. The Japanese had 40 or 50 planes in the air attacking various elements of the force. The carrier Lexington took a torpedo in the stern, which killed or wounded nearly 50 men. The Lexington was attacked several more times, but Captain Felix Stump and his men saved the ship, and as the moon went down at about 1:30 on the morning of December 5th, she could make 21 knots. The Japanese retired at moonset, and the task force relaxed. The next day they were far enough offshore so that a large Japanese force launched from the Marshalls could not find the ships, and Task Force 50 steamed back to Pearl Harbor without further difficulty. The incidents began to occur almost immediately after the carriers were moored. Admiral Pownall went off to report on the raid to Admiral Towers, but found Towers gone to Admiral John Hoover's command at Canton Atoll in the Phoenix Islands, 1,200 miles southwest of Pearl Harbor. Among General Richardson's many complaints about the Navy's employment of Army forces was the charge that his shore-based Army bombers had been misused in the Gilbert's operation. Richardson blamed the Navy. Admiral Towers blamed Admiral Spruance. Admiral Hoover blamed the Army for training its pilots to bomb from high altitude. When working in the Pacific Islands, he insisted, Norden bomb sites or not, the planes must get down on the target if they wanted to hit anything. This discussion at the Nimitz staff level had deteriorated into a hot argument, and Towers had been dispatched to investigate and report to the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Forces. Towers reported back, but the Army continued in its own ways, and the problem was not solved. Admiral Pownall then sat back and waited for Towers to return. But Pownall's junior officers were not waiting. They were furious at having been called away from the Kwajalein strike because Nellie was nervous again. On the voyage back to Pearl Harbor, the air intelligence officers had pored over the blow-ups of the aerial photographs and marked up the Japanese planes they could identify in their hidden revetments. As soon as the Yorktown was safely berthed, Captain J.J. Clark rushed to SINCPAC headquarters, flourishing a handful of prints. He found Towers gone, but he then went to the office of Rear Admiral Forrest Sherman, Nimitz's chief air officer. Sherman had recently been brought up to that post from the job as Towers' chief of staff, a recognition of Nimitz's increasing awareness of the importance of the carriers. Clark came bursting into Sherman's office that day, slapped the photographs on the desk, and began sorting them out to show what the task force had done, and had not done. Sherman looked them over carefully, then got up and opened the door to the next room, where Rear Admiral C.A. McMorris was located. McMorris was Nimitz's chief of staff. "Do you want to see the fish that got away?" asked Sherman. He took McMorris into his office and showed him the pictures, as Captain Clark stood by, expecting McMorris to show his own outrage. But McMorris was more interested in the photo that showed the half-built airstrip on Kwajalein. He picked it up and took it to Colonel Ralph Robinson, the assistant plans officer. Just at that moment, Robinson was worrying over the planning of the Marshall invasion. Where should they attack? Nimitz's commanders, Spruance, Turner and Smith, all held for attacking on the perimeter of the island group. Mili, Majuro and Maloelap were most often mentioned. When McMorris took the Kwajalein photo into Admiral Nimitz, the commander-in-chief decided then and there that Kwajalein must be the focal point. Spruance did not like the idea because after the Marshall's invasion, he was going to have to give up most of his ships to the Southwest Pacific to support MacArthur's next move. There were not enough resources to do otherwise. The deciding factor in the approval by the British-American Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Central Pacific Campaign had been Admiral King's promise that it would be carried out with resources available and would not deny the European theatre needed supply. Spruance, always the cautious man, did not like the idea of capturing a base in the heart of the Japanese-held Marshall Islands, then leaving it without a fleet to defend shipping that must come through. The enemy held atolls to reach Kwajalein. Turner and Smith agreed, but Nimitz said they must strike at the heart. Spruance would not have to worry about the fleet's absence. Land-based aircraft would protect the Marshall's bases from Japanese attack. Spruance, Turner and Smith made one last argument. What about the Japanese air bases on the Marshall atolls of Votia, Mili, Maloelap and Jalui? The carriers would neutralize them, said Admiral Nimitz, proving that he was far ahead of his commanders in appreciating the enormous change that the new carriers had brought to naval warfare. If the carrier force was to succeed in neutralizing Japanese air power, it must be used aggressively. And this was the next big issue that Nimitz had to resolve. The young Tuariks, the captains of the fast carriers, were complaining about Admiral Pownall's timidity in the employment of the task force. Captain Clark prepared a white paper, which he gave to Admiral Towers. Towers did not tell Clark, but he agreed completely. It was necessary to move quickly if a change was to be made, so Towers went to Nimitz to suggest that Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher be given command of the fast carrier force. Admiral Forrest Sherman verified everything Towers said about the problem, and Nimitz sent a message to Admiral King asking for the change. When Admiral Spruance learned of the plan, he was upset. Pownall was just his sort of carrier commander, efficient and, above all, cautious. If Pownall was given the task of guarding an invasion force, Spruance could be sure that he would not be off chasing the Japanese fleet. He was not so sure of the new breed of airmen, which Mitcher typified, men who believed the carriers should be set free to roam the seas and knock out Japanese opposition at its sources. Spruance complained and secured Nimitz's promise that Pownall would not be replaced until after the Marshall's invasion. Perhaps, suggested Forrest Sherman, Admiral Mitcher could go along on the Marshall's operation with Pownall as an observer. Nimitz liked that idea, but events moved too quickly for it to be adopted. The Marshall's invasion was scheduled for January 31st, a little over a month from the day of this discussion. It was Nimitz's habit to chew on ideas, and he worried over the problem of Pownall's command. Spruance emphasized his own conservatism by reopening the question of first invading the islands nearest Hawaii on the perimeter. He was still loath to strike at the heart and run the danger of encirclement. A reconnaissance plane that flew over Majuro Atoll saw no activity at all and was not fired on there, and when Spruance learned of that event, he went to Nimitz to again ask for an eastern base. Nimitz relented. As long as Majuro was undefended and would require no major effort, he would allow Spruance to take it as his protective base. But within a few days, he gave the bad news to Pownall and to Spruance. It was not Admiral Nimitz's way to mince words, and he did not this day. He told Pownall that he had been criticized for being too timid. He asked Pownall to put in writing what he would do in the future. Carriers, said Admiral Nimitz, must be risked. They could not damage the enemy if they did not go into his waters. Pownall's answers were not satisfactory. So by the end of the year, Nimitz had made his decision. Mark Mitcher would take over the carrier task force, Pownall would take over Admiral Towers' administrative job, and Towers would become Nimitz's deputy. More than anything that had happened to this point, these changes gave heart to the carrier men. Nimitz was showing his new concern and appreciation for the role of the carriers in the war. The original expansion of the Japanese military effort in 1941 and 1942 had given Japan control of half the Pacific Ocean, from the Aleutians on the north nearly to New Zealand on the south. This was the populous half. Except for a few dots of islands in the North and Central Pacific, the only important land area in Allied hands was the Hawaiian archipelago. But by 1943, the military situation had changed. The American invasion of Guadalcanal had led to a victory in the Solomon Islands. General MacArthur had moved north to New Guinea. The campaign of attrition, as the Solomons was sometimes called, had cost the Japanese dearly in ships, men, and especially in aircraft. The Battle of the Solomons was fought largely by the Japanese Naval Air Force, and that command lost 7,000 planes. The Naval Air Force was still primarily responsible for the defense of the Empire perimeter, but its resources were shattered by the spring of 1943. The Japanese Army insisted on retaining half of all aircraft produced in the Japanese factories, although the Army was suffering virtually no losses. The Japanese General Staff, dominated by General Tojo, the Prime Minister, had no sympathy for the Navy. When the Navy asked for more planes, the request was rejected. "Let the Navy show more Bushido spirit to throw back the enemy," said the Army. 1920 to the Marianas. In the spring of 1943, it was apparent that Bushido spirit is no substitute for ships and aircraft. The Japanese Fourth Fleet was charged with the defense of the South, but the shortage of ships and planes could not be denied. Vice Admiral Masashi Kobayashi ordered a survey of the defense possibilities. His planners advise a change in the defensive line. It would run from the tip of northern New Guinea to Truk, and then up to the Marianas. This meant that the Gilberts and the Marshalls, both east of that line, would not be seriously defended. Admiral Koga, chief of the combined fleet, agreed with that plan, and it was adopted in the summer of 1943. The commanders of the garrisons in the Gilberts and the Marshalls had been told that they were expected to defend their positions to the death. By the end of 1943, the Japanese were definitely off balance. In mid-October, the American carrier force had hit Wake, and Admiral Koga expected an invasion there. It seemed logical that the Americans would strive to retake the old captured territory. But early in November, Koga learned of the invasion of Bougainville by General MacArthur's forces and decided this was the M circumflex, or American thrust. Then came the carrier strike at Nauru Atoll, west of the Gilberts, and Admiral Koga realized that the Gilberts were the target for a new invasion. He decided to send reinforcements to help the garrison, but by the time they sailed from Truk and reached the Marshalls, the Gilberts were already lost. Admiral Kobayashi had moved his headquarters from Truk to Kwajalein, and the Japanese Second Fleet had sent some units to help reinforce the Gilberts. But when all was lost, the Second Fleet and the Fourth Fleet both retired to Truk. The Gilberts gone, the Marshalls would not be reinforced. Admiral Kobayashi expected the Americans to land at Jaluit or Mealy Atoll in the Marshalls, and then go against the last of the Solomons, New Britain, New Guinea, and finally the Philippines. T defense line would run from New Guinea to the Palais to the Marianas, as planned. The defense effort at the Gilberts had been a disappointment, but it would take the Americans time to assimilate their new victory, and the defenders of the Marshalls of the enemy plan's 21 circumflex could be expected to fight bravely. Rear Admiral Monzo Akiyama V knew what he was to do at Kwajalein. Rear Admiral Michiyuki F. Yamada, the commander at Roy, was ready too. No matter where the Americans landed, the Japanese would do their duty. They did not expect to survive the assault. Circumflex, 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 circumflex 4. Softening up. For 2 weeks after the return of Task Force 50 from Kwajalein strike, the carriers were in port at Pearl Harbor, refurbishing. The men had liberty. and the planes were inspected, tested, and replaced as needed. But the Marshalls were not forgotten. The airstrips in the Gilberts were used as a staging point for heavy bombers from the South Pacific. Nearly every day bombers and fighters struck the Marshalls. There was no question in anyone's mind, Japanese or American, the target would be the Marshalls. But the Japanese did have one question: which atoll? Mili had the largest single garrison. Sitting out as it did the southeast coma of the group, it seemed the likely candidate for invasion. But Kwajalein's 2 garrisons were also strong, and so were those at Jaluit, Malolap, and Votja. Before the strategic planners had written off the Gilberts and Marshalls in the summer of 1943, the Marshalls' garrisons had been strengthened with army troops. There were an estimated 13,000 troops in the group, and no garrison equalled that of Tarawa. Mili had 500 men, and so did Eniwetok. Kwajalein had about 5,000, on the 2 islands of Kwajalein and Roy Namur at the opposite ends of the atoll. 22. Softening up. 23. The Japanese had plenty of time to prepare their defences. They had begun before the Pearl Harbor attack. Originally, they had expected that an attack would come from the sea, but after the Gilberts invasion, in which the Americans had come in across the lagoon, they had moved their emphasis to the lagoon beaches. But the whole islands were prepared for defence. Once again, the blame for the defensive conditions could be traced back to the brief exploratory mission of Carlson's raiders in 1942. On balance, the Carlson raid had to be considered a disaster. For assessing it, the Japanese had created a major base at Mili, which had previously been a lookout station, and the fortifications of Kwajalein, Jaluit, Maloelap, and Votja were rebuilt, and a number of airstrips completed, although the Japanese reasoning was not entirely defensive. Until the autumn of 1943, the combined headquarters in Tokyo was still planning an attack that would wipe out the American air bases in the Ellis, Fiji, and Samoan Island groups. Those plans were dropped when the events in the South Pacific caused Admiral Koga to shorten his defensive perimeter, and for the first time actually to abandon AU thoughts of advances. If Midway was the turning point of the Pacific War, the Gilberts battle was the irrevocable proof that the war was lost. This shock could be concealed from the people at home, and was, but the Japanese strategists were under no illusions. In the Gilberts, in spite of the Koga plan to abandon that line of defence, efforts were made during the battle to reinforce the troops. A convoy was sent from Truk, but by the time it reached Eniwetok, the battle was over, so the troops were added to the Marshalls' defences. That would be the last. In view of the outcome of the Gilberts' invasion, no efforts would be made to save the Marshalls. In the Gilberts' battle, the Japanese had sent air reinforcements, and these were lost to the defence of the Marshalls. But up from the big base at Truk came more planes to replace them. So there were still enemy aircraft on the fields for the American bombers to hit in December and January. Those attacks by land-based heavy bombers and fighters reduced the force, but in the last 24 to the Marianas week of January, there were still more than 100 operational military aircraft on Japanese fields in the Marshalls. As the air attacks continued in January, Admiral Koga decided that the invasion of the Marshalls would come that month or the next. He did what he could to strengthen the defences without jeopardizing his resources. The Marshalls would be lost, but if the defenders could stall the Americans, every day meant more time for the building of defences elsewhere and more planes coming off the assembly lines in Japan. The last reinforcements came in December. Thereafter it was a question of moving around within the Marshalls, with the local commanders guessing which atoll would be the target. Captain Masanari Shiga, on Miyu, was certain that his island would be hit. It was the obvious choice, since it was closest to the Gilberts. He secured 1,500 reinforcements from Rear Admiral Akiyama at Kwajalein. But after mid-December, the frequency of American air raids was such that there was no further ship movement. The truth of the situation of the Marshalls' defenders could no longer be concealed from the troops. It was made quite plain by one simple order. They were to plant and tend vegetable gardens as part of their official duties. So every man knew that there would be no more help from home. except for inter-island radio communications and the regular daily news broadcast from the Domei station in Japan, the defenders of the Marshalls were alone. By the middle of January, as Admiral Koga had predicted, the Americans were ready to launch their invasion. The fast carrier task force was dispatched to make a series of air before the invasion and then to support the troops. This last was Spruance's idea and was roundly condemned by the airmen as a waste of their efforts. Mitcher and the others had an instrument more powerful than the Japanese combined fleet had been at the outbreak of the war. It consisted of 6 big fleet carriers and 6 light carriers. There were also 8 new fast battleships capable of speeds of 30 knots, heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers. Behind them came a fleet of oilers, softening up 25 repair ships and supply ships, protected by escort carriers and destroyers. The carrier fleet could move fast, strike fast, and move again. To keep it penned up alongside an atoll, supporting ground troops, seemed to the airmen the height of fooshness, not only a waste of time, but a definite endangerment. If the Japanese had any aircraft and submarines, the invasion would draw them to the battle scene, and the carriers would be put at risk to no good purpose. That was the airman's argument, but Spruance was in command, and he had some support from Admiral Pownall, who would ride with Spruance in this invasion as his unofficial air advisor. Spruance insisted that the carriers protect the landings, and he would have his way, this time. On January 19th, Spruance avoided all further argument about use of the force by sailing in the Indianapolis for Tarawa to consult with Admiral Hoover about the use of land-based aircraft during the invasion. On January 23, Admiral Turner sailed. The invasion was committed. 84,000 American troops were converging on the Marshall Islands to attack fewer than a quarter of their number of Japanese. On January 29th, Admiral Mitcher sent his 4 carrier task groups to strike the air bases of the Marshalls. Rear Admiral J.T.W. Reeves's group, led by the Kaihei Enterprise, hit Maloelap, but found very few planes there and almost all of them on the ground. His worst casualty was accidental. 2 torpedo bombers collided over Maloelap and 6 men were lost. Rear Admiral A.E. Montgomery was assigned to attack Roy, one of the central positions of the Kwajalein Atoll. The Japanese had apparently guessed that Kwajalein would be attacked. Foremost of the fighters were located here. As the Americans came in, a squadron of Zeros went up to neutralize the combat air patrol, and when the American airstrike came in over the airfield, more Zeros appeared. But the new American F-6F Hellcat fighter plane was more than a match for the Zero. Gone were the days when that Japanese plane was the fastest and most maneuverable aircraft in the Pacific. The single greatest advantage 26 to the Marianas of the F-6Fs was their armor, which protected the pilots while they hammered away at the unarmored Japanese fighters. The result was predictable. The Zeros began to go down in flames. By 8:00 that morning, the last fighter had been eliminated. During the invasion, no more fighter planes were launched from any point in Kwajalein Atoll. Rear Admiral Frederick C. Sherman's task group was virtually unopposed when it hit Kwajalein Island at the southern end of Kwajalein Atoll. Anti-aircraft fire was more disturbing, and the bombers were sent in to neutralize the guns. They knocked out some of them. The 4th Carrier Group, led by Rear Admiral S.P. Jinder, struck the airfield at Votya, but found little there. Most of the planes had been moved to Ruai. The next day, Jinder moved on to Maloelap, and then divided his time between the 2 atolls, just to make sure the Japanese did not bring any aircraft in from southern bases. By the time the troops were ready to land, their opposition had been destroyed. There was no Japanese navy in evidence, at least on the surface, and the anti-aircraft guns had been destroyed or damaged, or were keeping silent to save their efforts. Beneath the sea, the story was slightly different. The Japanese submarine RO-39 came up as the attacks on Votya were in progress, and was ordered from Truk to take station there. Lieutenant Commander Sunao Tabata was en route to Kwajalein, filled with hope and the confidence of one important victory over the Americans. His 175 had sunk the escort carrier Liscom Bayoff Markin in the Gilbert's invasion. Now he would have a chance to try again. Rear Admiral Noburo Owada, commander of submarines at Truk, also sent RO-40 to Kwajalein and Ielvust up from the Samoa Ailitse Islands Channel to take station east of the Marshalls. These were all the submarines he could spare. The others were being used to carry supplies to the beleaguered Japanese soldiers in the South Pacific Islands. The submarine men found this duty demeaning and protested as volubly as did the American carrier officers about their lot. Softening up 27, but the Japanese Navy had an even better reason for its odd behavior. The whole Japanese war effort was dominated by the Army, and had the Navy refused this wasteful use of its weapons, the Army would have refused to supply troops to the Navy defences, and Premier General Tojo would have backed them to the hilt. The handful of submarines assigned to the Marshalls' defences certainly could not change the outcome, but this was the only assistance that Admiral Koga was in a position to give at the end of January 1st, 944. 5. The attack. Majuro and Roy Namur Admiral Spruance had been worried about safeguarding his line of communications until Admiral Nimitz gave him permission to take Majuro. That way ships could thread their way by the Majuro Atoll, avoiding close proximity to powerful Mill on the south and Maloelap on the north. Rear Admiral Harry Hill, one of the bright young officers Admiral Turner had brought into his expanding amphibious force, was chosen to take Majuro, and then to back up the Kwajalein invasion that would be staged that same day. He carried the reserve troops that were not expected to be needed immediately. The landings on Majuro would be made by the 27th Division's troops, a reinforced battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Frederick B. Sheldon, and by the V Amphibious Corps Reconnaissance Company of the Marines, led by Captain James L. Jones. It was not a large force, but the absence of any activity on the island, as observed by the planes flying over in the past 2 months, indicated that there were few Japanese there, so these 1,500 troops should be enough to take the objective. The first landing was made at about 11 o'clock on the night of January 30th by Marine Lieutenant Harvey C. Weeks, and a handful of men who went in by rubber boat from a fast transport. They were looking for a native to give them information, and they soon found one. The native told them there were Japanese on Darrit Island, but not anywhere else in the atoll. He said the number was about 300. Weeks and his men had landed at Catalina Island, just at the channel through the reef into the lagoon. The transport then went about 12 miles to the eastern end of the atoll and landed Captain Jones and his men on Dalap Island. Jones encountered natives who told him all the Japanese but 4 had left the island more than a year before, and those 4 were on Majuro Island, at the other side of the atoll. Meanwhile, Admiral Hill had ordered a naval bombardment of Darrit, which began just after 6 o'clock on the morning of January 31st. Jones got through, and the bombardment was stopped after 15 minutes. The captain sent a detachment to Darrit. The men found complete buildings, evidence of construction, and not too much damage from the gunfire. That evening, troops landed on Majuro and captured the only Japanese there, Warrant Officer Nagata of the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had been left behind when the Japanese deserted the island as protector of the imperial property, which included a small store of dynamite and several machine guns. The advance base had been captured without the loss of a man. Within a few days, work would start on airstrips here. No one had expected much trouble at Majuro, although the absolute desertion of the island came as something of a surprise. But Admiral Turner and General Holland Smith expected that Kwajalein would have many of the aspects of Tarawa, with the additional complication that there were 2 objectives to be taken: Roy Namur on the north and Kwajalein Island on the south. Kwajalein is a large atoll, more than 60 miles from end to end, but these ends were the only important points. The northern base would be attacked by Rear Admiral Richard L. Connolly's force, which included the 4th Marine Division as attack troops. The division had never been in combat and had come from San Diego for this assault. Admiral Turner commanded the Kwajalein attack force himself. Indeed, General Holland Smith complained that Turner really wanted to be a general, and when he looked at the battle plans a few days before sailing, he found that his name was not on them, a matter he quickly rectified, for the Marines were not going to have an admiral running their show. The troops of this force were the 7th Army Division under Major General C.H. Corlett. He and Major General Harry Schmidt of the 4th Marines would both report to General Smith once the landings were secured. The landings would be supported by Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's force of old battleships, cruisers and destroyers, which would first bombard the islands and then provide fire support for the troops on request. They, in turn, would be assisted and protected by Rear Admiral Van H. Ragsdale's escort carrier group, which would take some, but not all, of the responsibility from the fast carriers. 3 escort carriers were assigned to the Kwajalein landings and 2 to Admiral Hill's Majuro landing, just in case of trouble. But since there was no trouble, the Hill force would be available. Roy Namur was so named because there were 2 islands here, connected by a causeway built by the Japanese. Roy was almost entirely an airfield. Namur was the defensive position where the troops lived. Nearly 21,000 Marines were in the transports, prepared to move against the 2,800 Japanese defenders. Roy Namur housed 4 big, 12.7 centimeters guns, 2 on Roy and 2 on Namur, and a number of 37 mm guns, anti-aircraft guns, and smaller weapons on both islands. The Americans expected that the Marshalls would be more stoutly fortified than the Gilberts, but it was not true. There were not nearly so many guns, nor so careful a plan of firefields. A number of concrete blockhouses had been built, 3 big ones on Roy, and the machine guns were emplaced in concrete pillboxes. But the reefs were not mined, nor were anti-personnel mines buried around the islands. There was relatively little wire and only 2 major anti-tank obstacles except for ditches. Admiral Yamada had organized his defences around 7 strong points on the 2 islands, but he did not have the strength to repel 8 times as many assault troops as he had defenders. The Americans, of course, had no way of knowing the relative strength of the Japanese defences, and after the difficulties at Tarawa, General Smith was taking no chances. He wanted all the fire support the Navy would give him, but once his troops began to move, he wanted marine guns to support them too. So the plan called for the preliminary capture of 4 little islands around Roy Namur, Melu, Enuabing, Enumene, and Enubir. A battalion of marine artillery would then be brought to each island, and from 4 angles they could concentrate their guns anywhere they might be needed. At 5:35 on the morning of January 31st, the ships of Admiral Connolly's invasion force were in place off the atoll. The battleship Maryland began the shelling a few minutes later, and other ships joined in. The bombardment continued for more than an hour, then was let up so that planes of the escort carriers could make a strike. That completed, the ship's guns began booming once again. The landing craft were hampered by unfavourable wind and heavy seas. They milled about for 2 hours, and several amphibious vehicles were swamped. When they came into the islands, they were preceded by a wave of landing craft that had been fitted with rockets, and these vessels delivered a final barrage on the beaches. Craft carrying tanks then came up, and the tanks began shelling the beaches with their 37 mm guns. Then the troops landed. They stormed ashore and began inching forward. But there was little need to inch, because Melu held 19 Japanese and Enuabing held 16. Most of them were killed, a few were captured. The Marines then turned to Enumanet and Enubir. By late afternoon, both little islands were taken, one by the 2nd Battalion and the other by the 3rd, and at no time did they encounter more than a platoon of enemy. Because of Tarawa, the Marines were geared up to face lions, but the lions were not in evidence. By nightfall, Roy Namur was bracketed. The battleships and cruisers were still pouring shells into Roy Namur. Admiral Connolly was determined that General Smith should have no cause for complaint about the Navy this time. Just after noon, he sent a message to the battleship Maryland. "Move in really close this afternoon for counter-battery and counter-blockhouse fire." Thus was born the nickname Close-in Connolly, by which the Admiral would be known for the rest of the war. It was mid-afternoon before troops were landed on Enubir and Enumene Islands, not because of Japanese resistance, but because of a shortage of amphibious vehicles and the Marines' ignorance of the reefs and shores. These islands, too, were lightly defended. The Marines ran into small pockets of defenders who fought, and they killed 34 Japanese on the 2 islands. Marine casualties were higher from accidents and drowning in the surf than from enemy activity. Last, that day, the island of Enugarit was occupied, and by the end of D-Day all missions had been accomplished. Roy Namur was isolated and surrounded, and the Marines had field guns ready to open fire. The Marines had lost fewer than 30 men and suffered wounded casualties of another 40. They had killed about 135 Japanese in the process of taking the islands. While the Marines were surrounding Roy and Namur with guns, Admiral Connolly's ships were bombarding the 2 islands all day long. On the night of D-Day, 3 destroyers kept up the pressure, firing star shells and explosives at the 2 islands to keep the Japanese off balance and prevent them from getting any sleep. The main attack would come at dawn. The 23rd Regimental Combat Team would land on the southern beaches of Roy, and the 24th Regimental Combat Team would land on the southern beaches of Namur. All this was to be accomplished by use of the vessels the Americans had developed especially for amphibious landings. Key to these was the LST, landing ship tank, a squat transport with shallow draft that was capable of coming in close to the beach, under normal conditions, and landing vehicles and men through its bow, which opened like a trap door. Inside the LSTs, in these deep conditions, the Marines boarded LVTs, landing vehicle tank, amphibious tractors. The LSTs then moved into the lagoon as dawn neared, while the warships outside began the barrage. Admiral Turner saw the small area to be attacked, and from his readings of the aerial photographs, he predicted that Roy Namur was going to be a tougher nut to crack than Tarawa had been. How tough a nut remained to be seen. The barrage began again at 6:50 a.m., but the landing forces were having trouble. A number of the LVTs used the day before had sunk in the surf. Some had gotten lost in the darkness instead of finding their proper LST. There were not enough to go around, and LCVPs, landing craft, vehicles and personnel, had to be brought up instead. So the landings, scheduled for 10 o'clock that morning, were postponed for an hour. Meanwhile, the Navy ships of Ediore were blasting the islands with everything that could shoot. Their targets were there on the maps: 6 artillery positions, 8 blockhouses, 65 pillboxes, and about 200 buildings, including 2 aircraft hangars on Roy. Whatever was in those hangars represented the only Japanese air power in the Marshalls. Not a single plane was in shape to fly, and there were no enemy air attacks. At Tarawa, one of the Marines' most bitter complaints was that the Navy had stood off 10 miles and fired at random, which they never hit. At Roy Namur, the cruisers moved in to just a mile off the beach, and the battleships, with their deeper draft, stood off only 3,500 yards. By naval standards, this was point-blank range. Half an hour before the new time set for hitting the beach, torpedo and dive bombers from the carriers. Cabot and Intrepid bombed the 2 islands, and a wave of fighters swept along the beaches, strafing. Admiral Mitcher was following Admiral Spruance's ideas on the use of carriers to support landing operations, no matter how he felt about it. The strike completed, the aircraft were warned away, and the barrage began again. So intensive was this battering that the Marine air observers, flying around in light planes to direct spot bombing, said they could not see anything on either of the islands because of the smoke and dust raised by bombs and shells. Just offshore, the Marines milled about in their vessels. Some units had lost communication with higher command. Their radios had been drenched in salt water and failed. The doors of one LST jammed, and the smaller vessels could not be brought out. The idea was that the LSTs would open up and the LVTs would come out and form up into waves to land. But several LVTs of one group got lost and had to be found. So the minutes passed and the Marines were still not on the beach. By 11 o'clock, this confusion became a matter of concern to Admiral Connolly. One purpose of his intense barrage that morning had been to stun the enemy so that the Marines could land while the defenders were still in a state of shock. But the longer it continued, the more used to the gunfire the Japanese must become. Further, the small landing vehicles had limited fuel storage, and it was unthinkable that an invasion should be held up until the boats ran out of gas. In the case of LVTs, it was dangerous. These vessels shipped a lot of water and were kept afloat by pumps working all the time. But if they ran out of gas, pumps quit and the LVTs would sink, taking down their tanks. So something had to be done in a hurry. Offshore in his flagship, the Indianapolis, Admiral Spruance followed the delays imperturbably, at least as far as anyone around him could tell. Spruance's greatest asset was his unflappability. He had planned this invasion, then turned it over to subordinates he trusted, and now he was not going to interfere with them unless the need came for a major command decision. Not far away rode the Rocky Mount, Admiral Turner's flagship. His communications with the fleet were excellent. The ship was one of the new communications command ships designed to meet the needs of this war. Turner, too, listened but did not interfere. It was Admiral Connolly's show until he got General Schmidt's men ashore and established. If they wanted any advice, they would ask for it. They did not. They decided not to wait for all the forces to assemble in the proper ranks and sent the first wave in a quarter hour after the 11 o'clock H hour. First went the armoured amphibious vehicles, carrying 37 mm guns and .30 caliber machine guns with which they sprayed the shore as they came close. LCI, landing craft, infantry gunboats were around them, firing guns and rockets at the beach. Behind came the infantry and the tanks. On Roy, the first to land were the men of the 1st Battalion, 23rd Marines. They hit Red Beach 2, and the 2nd Battalion hit Red Beach 3 on their right. Ahead of them, the armoured amphibians grounded ashore and kept going without a hitch up to the first anti-tank trench, which stopped them. By noon, the first 2 waves of infantry had landed on Roy. The smoke was so thick that observers on the ships offshore could not see them, and the troops could scarcely see in front of them. On Namur, on the other side of the causeway, the 3rd Battalion of the 24th Marines landed on Green Beach 1 at about the same time. The 2nd Battalion on Green Beach 2 was a little faster in coming in. The invasion was launched. The island of Roy had been so blasted by naval artillery and bombs that it looked like a wasteland. The majority of the 3,700 defenders of Roy Namur had been killed by the bombardment, although the Marines did not know this at the time. What they saw as they came up were slow-moving, apparently punch-drunk defenders who hardly seemed capable of fighting. There were no obstacles on the beaches, and the only difficulty was with the anti-tank ditch just behind the beach. Soon, as the tanks came ashore, they found a spot where the gunfire had filled in the ditch and went across. On the other side of the ditch, they formed into a line and clattered toward their first objective, the airfield. Behind them came the infantry. Some of the infantrymen were ready to declare a little war of their own. A number of the armoured amphibians had stopped at the shoreline and let the troops go on through, then gave them support fire from behind. Some Marines were shot by their own guns, and their buddies suggested that the amphibians were more dangerous than the Japanese. As for the Japanese enemy, the invasion of Roy was proceeding in a manner that would please even Howling Mad Smith, that spirited taskmaster. The bombardment had been spectacularly successful. The infantry moved up slowly, investigating every foot of ground. They had been told repeatedly of the tricks of the Japanese at Tarawa, hiding in abandoned vehicles, playing dead, and then firing on the Marines from behind. They were taking no chances. Still, in half an hour, tanks and troops had reached the first-day objective, a line some 200 yards inland from the beach. The 2nd Battalion tanks faced a dilemma there. Ahead were anti-tank guns in the blockhouses, according to the intelligence they had. If they stayed on the line, in the open they would be sitting ducks for the enemy. They radioed Colonel Lewis R. Jones, the commander of the 23rd, asking for permission to move ahead. The air was full of interference, and the message never got through. The tanks started up and began to move anyhow. On their left, the men of the 1st Battalion also reached this line. They had expected rough going at Wendy Point, where the enemy had built a group of pillboxes. But when they got there, the pillboxes were holes in the ground, so they went on and soon met up with the 2nd Battalion and forged ahead onto the airfield runway. By 1 o'clock that afternoon, they had gotten through to Colonel Jones. He shared their elation at the easy going and radioed to General Schmidt aboard the flagship, "Give us the word and we will take the rest of the island." When General Schmidt received that message, he was more concerned than relieved, for he was also told that the tanks and the troops had moved beyond the first objective line and scattered. Until they were reassembled, there was no way an assault could be made against the north half of the island, where the bulk of the enemy were presumed to be. He told Colonel Jones to settle down and get his troops back to the line and under control. The process took nearly 2 hours. The Marines of the 4th Division had not been in combat before, and now it all seemed so easy they were bent on getting a Jap and taking some souvenirs in the process. But by 3 o'clock in the afternoon they were brought back, and the attack could continue in order. Company F moved forward against a concrete building that had been untouched by the bombardment, although the buildings all around it were rubble. A Marine moved cautiously up to the steel door, kicked it open, and tossed in a grenade while his companions covered his progress with a hail of fire from M1 rifles. The grenade exploded, and he looked inside. He found 1 dead Japanese. The battalion continued to move. Soon the troops came to a blockhouse, 3 feet of reinforced concrete in the walls. It had been hit by naval shells and bombs, but was far from demolished. Lieutenant Colonel Edward J. Dillon, the battalion commander, asked for a dive-bombing attack on the blockhouse, but was turned down because the troops were too close. He ordered Company G to take the position. First, a 75 mm half-track was sent up to fire against the steel door. The half-track had fired 5 rounds when a demolition squad came up. The half-track continued to fire, and the demolition men put charges at the ports and Bangalore torpedoes through the shell holes in the roof. When they exploded, the infantry came up and tossed grenades, and then the troops entered. They found 3 heavy machine guns, a large supply of ammunition, and 3 dead Japanese soldiers. They also discovered that the Japanese had built their defences for an attack from the sea. The 3 gun ports faced north, east, and west. There was no gun port at the south, toward the lagoon, through which the Marines had come. Eastward from this blockhouse ran a system of trenches and machine gun positions that looked down on the beach. Here was the centre of Japanese resistance on Roy. The Marines moved along the trenches and killed a number of Japanese, but they found far more already dead. Had the bombardment not been so effective, their task would have been far more difficult. As it was, most of the resistance was concentrated in pillboxes and blockhouses that had remained more or less intact. By 5 o'clock that afternoon, the 2nd Battalion had taken its objectives and settled down. The 1st Battalion moved on along the west coast of the island and found a few scattered riflemen who fought until they were killed. In one trench they discovered 50 enemy soldiers, all dead from the bombardment. By 6 o'clock that night, they too had secured their positions and stopped. All that remained for the next day's work was the mop-up of the small pocket of Japanese troops that remained in the centre of the airfield. After dark, somebody fired off a gun, and then there was a rash of firing on Roy. The officers managed to quiet the men down and then investigated. It was not enemy, but trigger-happy Marines. Luckily, no harm was done, and the Marines on Roy settled down for a quiet night. Namur was a different story. The confusion of landing hurt the 24th Regimental Combat Team more than it had the Marines of Roy, for only about 60 of the 111 LVTs assigned to move the troops that morning could be found. The troops had to come in higgledy-piggledy, which was an affront to any trained amphibious officer. But in this case, the confusion was not particularly harmful. The bombardment had done its job, and resistance on the beach was very slight. The troops moved up to anti-tank ditches similar to those on Roy. In a quarter of an hour, the men of the 24th had moved 200 yards inland, except on the extreme right, where the Japanese had built a line of resistance and were manning it. The ease of their movement was illusory, for Namur held most of the troops defending the northern Kwajalein base. Nor had the bombardment been as effective on this island as it was on Roy, because the vegetation of Namur was heavy, and although many buildings were knocked down, the Japanese found hiding places in the brush. Companies I and K came first. One of the first things they noticed was that the fire of the enemy was almost totally uncoordinated. Back at San Diego, they had been warned of the Japanese expertise at building interlocking fields of fire, but in the Marshalls there seemed to be none of this, to the great relief of the Americans. Companies I and K moved along, and Company B, the reserve, came in after noon and mopped up small pockets of resistance that remained. Much of the difficulty they faced was American-made. The company had 3 tanks, but 2 of them bogged down in the sand churned up by the long bombardment, and the third slid into a shell hole and slipped a track. They were not destroyed, but for the moment they were out of action. Luckily, the assault companies of the 3rd Battalion did not need them that morning and early afternoon, after they came in from Green Beach 1. On Green Beach 2, Companies E and F had almost the same experience, some difficulties caused by the bombardment's effects, few caused by the enemy. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the Marines on both beaches had reached their first objective. Before them, on the southeast or right side, was Sally Point, the southeast promontory of Namur. In planning, the Marines had expected strong resistance here, for the point commanded the beaches around it. But again, the effects of the bombardment had been felt. The Marines found only 2 machine guns on Sally Point and cleared those out in a hurry. Early afternoon, then, found the Marines moving right ahead on Namur with little indication of trouble. Then a Marine demolition team moved to a large building that looked like a blockhouse. For some time the ship's guns had been silent. The fleet was ready to fire on any target given it, so thoroughly had the Navy been briefed after Tarawa. But the troop commander called for a ceasefire because the Marines were moving too fast. Shortly after noon, all the ships had quit firing, and the only artillery heard was that of the Marine guns on the surrounding islands. At 12:50, they were supposed to complete their bombardment as well. The troops were told that from this point on they would have to rely on their own field weapons. Since the blockhouse represented a definite threat to the advance of Company F of the 2nd Battalion, the demolition men were told to bring down the building. They crept forward under cover from the riflemen and placed a shaped charge, plastic explosive, against the side of the building, then retreated. When they blew the charge, it tore a hole in the building, and one demolition man moved up with a 16-pound satchel charge and tossed it in. Immediately, the building blew up with an enormous roar and a cloud of smoke that ran hundreds of feet into the air. Debris began falling all over the island. "The whole damn island has blown up," shouted a Marine observer who was riding in a torpedo plane above the island. As the debris rained down on the 2nd Battalion command post, someone shouted, "Gas!" and the Marines began fumbling for gas masks most had discarded on the beaches as too much trouble to carry. But it was not gas, as investigation later showed. It was the explosion of the air base's aerial torpedo supply dump, containing scores, perhaps hundreds of long-lance torpedoes. The building might have been blown up by a stray shell from a late-firing gun. It might have been blown up by heroic Japanese defenders determined not to be captured. But probably it was blown up by the satchel charge. Down on the troops came chunks of reinforced concrete, twisted pieces of steel that had the impact of shrapnel and the exploding torpedoes. 20 Marines were killed by the concussion or by falling debris. Another 80 were wounded. And a few minutes later came 2 more explosions, either triggered by the first or caused by the Japanese defenders. More Marines fell, and more important to the invasion, communications between the battalion command post and the line companies were destroyed. From that point on, Lieutenant Colonel Francis H. Brink, the battalion commander, had to rely on runners to keep in touch. The explosions, stopping the Americans for the first time, seemed to put heart into the Japanese. All along the line, the sound of the small-caliber Japanese rifles could be heard, and the characteristic pop-pop of the Japanese light machine guns joined in. As the Americans stopped to reorganize and were in position for 2 hours, the Japanese had a chance to reorganize their own defenses. They began to fight with determination. Colonel Franklin A. Hart, the regimental commander, hoped to capture the entire island before the end of the day. It was already growing late, but at 4:30 in the afternoon, the troops seemed ready to make the push to the north shore that would complete the task. This time, however, the ground was contested. The tanks moved ahead. The infantry was supposed to move right along with them to protect the flanks, but the Marines often found themselves ducking behind fallen palms and other debris and searching for snipers in the brush, in the debris of buildings, in the trees ahead, and sometimes behind them. Some of the tanks got ahead of the troops, and then there was apt to be trouble. The command tank of Company B of the 4th Tank Battalion got out ahead of the troops and its own tanks, and had stopped to reconnoitre when Captain James L. Denig realised that he was alone. Out of the brush ran half a dozen Japanese, straight for the tank. One of them dropped a grenade into the open port of the turret, and it exploded inside, killing the driver and mortally wounding Captain Denig. The infantrymen, who had fallen behind, came up then and killed the Japanese. The tanks had no difficulty in penetrating, and some of them reached the road on the north shore, which the Marines called Narcissus Street. This road ran parallel to the shoreline, about 100 yards in from the beach. It became the last Japanese defence line that day. Darkness fell as the Marines came up to the road, and they were ordered to stop and dig in for the night. As the old hands knew, it was more than unfortunate that the island could not be taken in the daylight hours. For that night, the Japanese harassed the troops. Those who had been bypassed came out to fight, which meant they were behind the lines. Those on the other side of the North Shore Road began to infiltrate, and there were a number of foxhole fights for life. At dawn, about 100 Japanese came charging against a weak spot in the line where Company 1 and Company B had lost contact. In this banzai charge, a Japanese grenade came hurtling into a position occupied by half a dozen Marines. Private Richard K. Sorensen saw it come and covered the grenade with his own body. It blew up, but miraculously, Sorensen was only wounded, not killed, and the others were saved. Sorensen received the Congressional Medal of Honor for this act of bravery. Medium tanks had been landed the day before on Roy to support the 23rd Marines' attack on the airfield. They were brought up that morning to Namur and led the drive to clear the island. It was accomplished by 2 o'clock in the afternoon on February 2nd. When the fighting ended after 2.5 days, the Marines assessed their casualties and those of the enemy. They had suffered 190 dead and 547 wounded. The Japanese garrison had been almost completely wiped out, with 3,472 enemy dead counted, and 51 prisoners of war plus 40 Korean labourers who surrendered. As it turned out, by the time the Americans attacked, the garrison at Roy Namur was smaller than expected, about 1,000 less than at Tarawa. But the relative ease of the operation was in large part due to the enormous effort of the Navy in bombarding the small islands before the troops landed. When it was all over, naval officers began to refer to the Roy Namur assault as the perfect one. Perhaps one of the reasons that Admiral Turner did not interfere at all with Admiral Connolly's conduct of the Roy Namur invasion was that he was personally supervising the invasion of Kwajalein Island at the southern end of the atoll, and by D-Day he had his hands full. At 11 p.m. on the night of January 30th, the destroyer transports Overton and Manly moved into Gaya Pass, the entrance through the coral reef to the southern part of Kwajalein's lagoon. Each destroyer was carrying 155 men of the Army's 7th Division, picked men who would capture the islands in the next few hours. After some confusion because of the darkness and seas made choppy by the trade wind, those troops assigned to Gaya Island reached shore about daylight. They found no resistance as they beached the rubber boats and moved inland. At the northwest corner of the island, they did see an observation tower and flushed one Japanese soldier, who was killed. But as they came down the south side of the island, the Americans suddenly came under fire. Second Lieutenant Claude Hombarker ordered his men to set up a machine gun in the crotch of a tree and lay down fire on the whole area. Sergeant Leonard Brink moved forward and found the Japanese ensconced in a shell crater. He began hurling grenades into the crater, while the machine gun fired over his head. After the resistance seemed to slacken and the return grenade fire to stop, Brink led other members of the platoon into the crater with knives and bayonets. When the struggle ended, 19 Japanese soldiers were dead, and 1 American was wounded. That action was the only important resistance on Gaea. A few more Japanese were killed, singly, and then the island was secure. Moving against the neighbouring island of Nina, the second force became disoriented and landed on Gaea, the next islet to the west. A garrison of about 125 Japanese was stationed there, and the American landing party ran into resistance. They stopped near a Japanese tugboat stranded on the beach and radioed General Corlett, who told them to get over to Nina. Captain Paul Gritter, the leader of the landing party, left a detachment under Captain Gilbert Drexel on Gaea and went to Nina, which was unoccupied, so the channel was protected. The troops left on Gaea were attacked by the Japanese, but they held them off until reinforcements could be brought in to clear the island. It was a hard task, hardest of all during the preliminary fighting, because the Japanese outnumbered the Americans and kept renewing their attacks. It resisted the effects of flamethrowers, so the demolition men came up with charges and white phosphorus that created dense choking smoke to drive the Japanese out. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the 184th had reached the north-south connecting road, called Wilma Road, and turned south to link up with the 32nd. The next step would be to take the airfield. By late afternoon, the invasion was totally secure. About 11,000 troops were ashore, and supplies were coming in steadily from the ships without difficulty. The absence of a single Japanese aircraft all day long was a blessing for which the invaders could thank the Fast Carrier Task Force and Admiral Hoover's land-based Air Force. Had this been a marine invasion, perhaps in the late afternoon those 11,000 men would have surged into action to storm the airfield. In his History of U.S. Naval Operations in World War II, Samuel Eliot Morison so indicates, an implied criticism of the Army's way of fighting. But the Army was doing very well, particularly in the face of mounting Japanese resistance. The defenders had built strong fortifications on the lagoon and ocean sides of the airfield to protect the runways. 3 coastal defence positions had been built on the south or ocean side of the island. The Japanese had also cleared away the palms around this area to give them open fields of fire. But from the north-south road back several hundred yards, the Japanese retired swiftly in the south. On the northern side, the 184th ran into more difficulty from enemy troops in prepared positions. They were stopped by an explosion. A shell fired from Enubuj Island had ignited a fuel dump, and it went up with a roar. But around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the 32nd was also slowed when Company E encountered positions that were connected by underground tunnels. The Japanese would defend a position until the Americans were virtually on top of them and then disappear. The farther the Americans moved toward the centre of the island, the tougher the defence became. At 6 o'clock that evening, the assault was stopped for the night and the troops dug in. The 3rd Battalion of the 184th had encountered far more enemy resistance than had the 32nd, but the 3rd Battalion had suffered only 10 men killed and 13 wounded. The 32nd Regimental Combat Team had 7 killed and 23 wounded. They had killed about 500 Japanese defenders and taken 11 prisoners. So although by naval standards the army was slow, the caution had paid off in low casualties on this first day of the invasion. The high number of enemy dead had to be attributed in large part to the effective bombardment of Admiral Turner's warships. In all, it had been a satisfactory first day. The troops had occupied about a quarter of the island and were thoroughly organised. The next day they could begin to deal with the estimated 1,500 Japanese defenders who remained on the island. That night, the problem was to protect the perimeter and prevent the Japanese from launching banzai attacks that could cause many casualties. The divisional artillery was given the job of providing harassing fire that night. General Charles Corlett moved ashore with his staff to a command post on Enubuj Island. On Kwajalein, the troops dug foxholes and waited. It began to rain, a chill, pelting rain that soaked the men in their foxholes. After dark, the Japanese began to move. Several Japanese guns at the northern tip of the island began firing into the area. The destroyer Sigsbee had been detailed to keep a searchlight trained on the airfield for the first half of every hour. This light bothered the enemy and brought an attempt to knock it out. Sigsbee was standing offshore in the lagoon, and an anti-aircraft gun was depressed to fire on the destroyer. The anti-aircraft gun was knocked out by the Sigsbee's 5-inch gun. The Japanese brought up a replacement, but it was silenced. The Japanese then turned field pieces on the destroyer from Ibaye Island, north of Kwajalein, but they were no more effective. The troops ashore kept the area illuminated with star shells and flares to keep the Japanese off balance. The ships offshore were shooting again, which helped do the same. But the enemy came out anyhow, in small groups, attempting to infiltrate the American lines. At 1:30 in the morning, the Japanese launched a larger attack against Company L of the 184th Regimental Combat Team. The attack began with mortar shelling on the machine gun positions, which the Japanese had spotted earlier in the evening. 3 well-placed mortar shells fell on 1.50 caliber machine gun position, wounding several men and killing 1. The Japanese then attacked, and the platoon withdrew. The Japanese attacked the next platoon, but another heavy machine gun fired into them and stopped the attack. It was a momentary flurry, and reinforcements came up, but by the time they arrived, the action was over. Still, Japanese harassing fire continued all during the hours of darkness. Their mortars were particularly effective. Their targets were the machine guns and anti-tank guns. They struck again at Company L, knocking out another machine gun that had been sent up to replace the one destroyed earlier. They dropped a shell beneath an anti-tank gun, disabling the gun, killing 2 men and wounding another. So the night was anything but restful for the men of the 7th Division. On the morning of February 2nd, General Corlett ordered a coordinated attack by the 2 regimental combat teams. An artillery barrage would begin at 7 o'clock, and the troops would get ready. After 15 minutes of general fire, the guns on Enu Bouge would concentrate on specific targets. At 8 o'clock, the carrier planes would strike along the line. The troops would be already moving. On the northern side, in the 184th's area, the 2nd Battalion began the attack. The 1st Battalion came along close behind in support. On the southern ocean side, the 32nd Regimental Combat Team's 2nd Battalion also advanced after the artillery, and the Navy guns had laid down a barrage. The 184th troops advanced about 200 yards before they encountered much opposition. At first they came under sniper fire from Japanese hidden in the ruins of buildings and among fallen logs. They passed the central pier that had served the airfield on the lagoon side and continued along the northern side of the airfield. Their tanks sprayed the trees ahead to knock down snipers. Tanks and 37mm guns stopped at pillboxes to reduce them. Most of the infantry would go ahead, while a few soldiers stood by the tanks as they pulled up to their objectives. A tank would begin firing on a pillbox, its machine gun trained on the entrance. If the Japanese decided to come out, they were mowed down before they could launch a banzai charge. Before 11 o'clock in the morning, this method of reducing strong points while the infantry moved on had brought the 184th to the northeast end of the airfield, and they crossed the 2nd lateral road, called Carl Road. On the ocean shore, the 32nd ran into stronger opposition that morning. They called for an airstrike when the Japanese guns on the north shore began firing on them. They moved forward then, under considerable harassment from snipers, but they too were at the northwest end of the airfield and Carl Road by 11 o'clock that morning of the 2nd day. When the 32nd's troops had come up to Carl Road, they found they faced a clearing. On the other side of it, on the south, was a strong Japanese defensive position, which began with a deep tank trap. Behind it were pillboxes, machine gun emplacements, and artillery positions, all interlaced with trenches for the Japanese infantry and more anti-tank trenches. It was apparent to the regiment's officers that the Japanese intended to make a strong stand here to prevent anyone who crossed from the west from entering the northern section of the curved island, where most of the troop installations were located. Since this would demand a maximum assault effort, the fresh 3rd Battalion of the The assault was delayed, largely by confusion between the Navy and the Army. Admiral Turner's ship's captains were eager to deliver spot fire in support of the troops, but the Army men were not totally confident in the Navy's accuracy and preferred to wait for their own artillery. Since that artillery was serving both the 184th and the 32nd, sometimes the wait was long for fire on a specific point. That day, Admiral Turner decided the Army needed an airstrike on these positions in the south and ordered it for 1:30, which caused the Army to suspend its artillery fire. On the first day, an air observer and a Navy pilot had been killed when the torpedo bomber in which they were flying swooped down too low in the face of a barrage from the Army artillery and was destroyed by American shells in mid-air. So the Army was taking no chances of a repeat accident. The assault was finally delayed until 2 o'clock in the afternoon. When the assault began, it moved slowly as the tanks tested the area and their ability to avoid the anti-tank ditch. Finally, 4 tanks made their way around the ditch on the ocean beach and opened the way. The Japanese stayed in their pillboxes and underground defences and would not come out even when the Americans overran the area. They were killed inside the positions, down to a single soldier who surrendered. By the end of the day, this strongpoint, called Com, was largely in American hands. In the north, the 184th was stopped when it reached the end of Carl Road by heavy artillery fire that originated in the north and began falling on the airfield. The shells were fired from Ebay Island, a short distance north of Kwajalein, and the troops on the airfield were on a direct line with their targets. The airstrikes hit the targets and silenced the Ebay guns, but the artillerymen, entrenched in the ruins of the once vital airfield, could not be silenced entirely. The American losses during the day mounted in the 32nd battalions. They lost about 200 men to snipers and the stronger Japanese positions. The 184th lost another 20 men killed and more wounded by the artillery fire. The end of the day found the 184th stopped near Carl Road and the Lagoon Road. When a 37 mm anti-tank gun arrived, he sent it to fire against the blockhouse, but the light gun had absolutely no effect. Lieutenant Klatt decided to leave the stronghold for the tanks and demolition men to deal with and ordered his men to move around the obstruction. As they did so, they broke into small groups. The Japanese, seeing that the Americans were going to bypass them, began moving out of the stronghold in an effort to make their way back to another Japanese force. The area erupted in small arms fire, with the Japanese sniping at the Americans and the Americans firing back. Tanks came up and stopped before the blockhouse, but they did not fire on it. There was no one at the point to tell them what was needed. Lieutenant Klatt's platoon was out of communication with the command post, and in essence had been reduced to a group of individual squads for the moment. Meanwhile, the company's 2nd platoon, led by 2nd Lieutenant Frank Kaplan, moved around the other side of the blockhouse, and when Kaplan encountered fire from a wharf on the beach and forward areas, he asked for artillery fire. Soon it began coming in, almost in the midst of the men of 1st platoon. Klatt yelled at them and got them to move back behind the blockhouse to reorganize. All this effort was without progress, and it took an hour. Captain Charles A. White, the Company B commander, came up to see why the platoons were not moving. He had spent the last hour fielding questions from the battalion command post about the slow progress. He organized a 2-platoon attack led by tanks, but this attack bogged down because the tanks could not communicate with the infantry except by opening their hatches, and all this wasted more time. The blockhouse continued to slow the troops. There were many Japanese inside, and satchel charges seemed to have no more effect on the fortification than the 37 mm gun had earlier. So the advance stalled again.